Hitler was convinced American bombers were a bluff. He believed our pilots were soft and our planes couldn't reach his homeland. He was dead wrong, but proving it cost thousands of young men their lives, all because of one missing piece. We all remember the P-51 Mustang, but the air war in Europe wasn't won by the Mustang we think of. It was almost lost, and it was a British engine that finally turned the tide, proving Hitler's biggest underestimation was his last. In 1943, the skies over Germany were a slaughterhouse for American air crews. Hitler believed we'd break and go home. What he didn't count on wasn't just American courage, it was our stubborn refusal to accept that a single engine problem couldn't be solved. It's easy to look back on World War II, at the sheer industrial might of the United States, and think the outcome was inevitable. We see the photos of D-Day. The sky is black with Allied planes, and we assume that total air superiority was a given. But in 1942, and deep into 1943, it was anything but. In fact, America's entire daylight bombing strategy, the very strategy we had staked the air war on, was on the verge of complete and total collapse. Hitler was convinced that America's entry into the war was a political stunt, not a military one. He and Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, looked at our bombers as slow, clumsy targets. They believed our soft American pilots, raised on jazz and movies, would break under the pressure of real combat against the hardened aces of the German Air Force. What Hitler underestimated was not the technology we had in 1942. His underestimation, his fatal miscalculation, was of American resolve. He didn't believe we would willingly fly into a meat grinder day after day, take staggering, heartbreaking losses, and just keep coming. He didn't believe we would identify a single critical flaw in our arsenal and then move heaven, earth, and the entire Packard Motor Car Company to fix it. This is the story of that flaw. It's the story of what happened when our long-range planes, our mighty flying fortresses, flew without the one thing they needed most. This is the story of the air war before the Rolls-Royce engine changed everything. Our core belief, the doctrine of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was something the British thought was madness. The British, having been bloodied in 1940, had resorted to night bombing. They would fly in under the cover of darkness, dropping thousands of pounds of explosives on German cities, aiming for a general area and hoping to break civilian morale. It was, by its nature, inaccurate, but it was safer for the crews. The Americans, led by men like General Ira Eaker and Carl Toohey Spotts, believed in a different way. We called it precision daylight bombing. We weren't interested in terrorizing civilians. We were going to win the war by taking out the enemy's ability to make war. We would fly in broad daylight, in tight formations, and use the legendary Norden bomb sight to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. Or so the theory went. The heart of this theory was the B-17 Flying Fortress, and on paper, it truly was a fortress. The B-17G model bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns covering nearly every angle. The press and the bomber mafia who championed it sold the American public on an image of an invincible dreadnought of the skies, a plane that could fight its way to the target and back, all by itself. This belief was so strong that early on, fighter escorts were almost an afterthought. The theory was that the bombers, flying in tight combat boxes, could create interlocking fields of fire so dense that no German fighter could penetrate them. It was a beautiful, logical theory, and it was tragically wrong.
Hitler's Luftwaffe pilots were not fools. They were some of the best trained and most battle-hardened flyers in the world. Men like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders had perfected their craft in the skies over Spain, Poland, France, and Britain. When they first encountered the B-17, they were cautious. The .50 caliber was a fearsome weapon, but they were methodical. They probed, they tested, they found the weaknesses. They learned that the early B-17s were vulnerable from the front, a head-on CAS, where the bomber's own speed and the fighter's speed combined for a closure rate of over 600 miles per hour. The German pilot had less than 2 seconds to fire. But in that 2-second window, his 20mm or 30mm cannons firing explosive shells could shred a cockpit, killing the pilots instantly. The bomber's 50 cals, by contrast, fired solid slugs. They were brilliant defensive weapons, but the Germans were flying with an offensive punch. So the Americans adapted. We added chin turrets to the B-17G. We added more armor, more gunners. The plane got heavier, tougher. And the Germans adapted right back. They simply waited. They waited for the one thing they knew was the bomber's true, unfixable weakness, its little friends. A B-17 could be loaded with fuel to fly a 1,000-mile round trip, but the fighter planes of 1942 and early 1943 could not. The iconic British Spitfire, a marvel of the Battle of Britain, was a short-range interceptor. It had the legs of a sprinter. It could barely cross the English Channel, let alone fly deep into Germany. The American fighters we had in England were, at first, no better. The P-39 Airacobra was useless at high altitude. This left two main contenders, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. And this is where the core of Hitler's correct underestimation lay. The P-47, the Jug, was a monster. It was a 7-ton beast built around the most powerful radial engine of the day, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. It was tough as nails, could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and carried 8 50-caliber machine guns that could tear a German fighter to ribbons. Its pilots loved it, but that massive engine was incredibly thirsty. Its internal fuel supply gave it a combat radius of barely 200 miles. It couldn't even reach the German border from England. The P-38 Lightning was the other hope. It was a radical, twin-engine, twin-boom design. It was fast, packed a heavy punch of cannons and machine guns in its nose, and, thanks to its two engines, had the internal fuel for much greater range. On paper, the P-38 was the answer. But in the cold, damp, high-altitude skies of northern Europe, it developed crippling problems. Its engines were finicky and prone to failing in the extreme cold. Its cockpit heating system was notoriously awful, leaving pilots to suffer from debilitating frostbite on long missions. And its turbo superchargers, so brilliant in theory, had teething problems that made it a handful for pilots already strained to their limits. The Germans quickly learned to fear the fork-tailed devil, but it just wasn't reliable enough or available in enough numbers to be the war-winning escort we needed. So this was the brutal reality of 1943. Every single bomber mission was a calculation. The crews would fly out from England, a massive armada of silver planes, surrounded by their little friends. The P-47s and P-38s would swarm around them, fending off the first waves of Luftwaffe fighters. But then, inevitably, the moment would come. Over the radio, the bomber crews would hear the dreaded words from the fighter leader, "We are turning back. Their fuel is at bingo." One by one, the fighters would waggle their wings in a grim salute, peel off, and head for home. And the bombers had to fly on, alone. This was the moment the Luftwaffe lived for. The German controllers would track the Allied formations, letting the first waves of fighters wear themselves out against the American escorts. And the moment the escorts turned for home, they would unleash their main, fresh reserves. Hundreds of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 110s, armed with cannons and air-to-air rockets, would rise up and tear into the now defenseless bomber streams. For the bomber crews, it was hours of relentless mechanized terror. They were flying straight and level, unable to evade, while the yellow-nosed bastards of the Luftwaffe came at them again and again. They watched their friends in the next formation suddenly blossom into a bright orange fireball. They saw men, tiny specks, tumbling from burning planes without parachutes. They flew through the expanding clouds of black smoke and debris that had been, just 30 seconds before, another B-17 full of 10 men.
This is what Hitler was counting on. He was betting that no army in the world, not even the Americans, could sustain the horrifying losses this strategy produced. The USAF established a 25-mission combat tour for bomber crews. It was meant to be a ray of hope, a ticket home. But in 1943, the math was grim. The loss rates on easy missions were 4 or 5%. On tough missions, they could exceed 10 or 20%. The crewman's chance of actually finishing his 25 missions was statistically almost zero. The 8th Air Force was becoming a graveyard for America's best and brightest, and the breaking point was coming. If this kind of deep, unfiltered history is what you appreciate, if you believe these stories of sacrifice and ingenuity need to be told, taking a moment to subscribe to this channel is the single best way to support our mission. It tells us you value this history, and it helps us ensure these stories remain alive for the next generation. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to us. The crisis came to a head in the summer and fall of 1943. The 8th Air Force Command, led by General Eaker, believed that if they could just land one devastating blow on a key German industry, they could shorten the war. They settled on a target: the ball bearing factories in the city of Schweinfurt. Ball bearings were a critical component. Tanks, planes, U-boats, factory machines, everything that moved in the German war effort needed them. And a huge portion of them were made in this one city, deep inside Germany. It was a target so vital, the planners believed, that it was worth any cost. On August 17, 1943, they launched the mission. It was a double strike, a hugely ambitious plan. One force of bombers would hit the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg and then fly on to Africa, while another force would hit Schweinfurt and have to fight its way back home. It was a tactical disaster. The timing of the mission was thrown off by fog over England. The two forces, meant to divide the Luftwaffe's attention, flew hours apart. The Germans, their intelligence sharp, simply refueled and rearmed their fighters and met both forces at full strength. The Regensburg force got mauled. The Schweinfurt force was decimated. We lost 60 B-17s that day. 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. The planners were horrified. We had proven we could find the target. We had proven we could bomb it with accuracy despite the smoke and the flak. And we had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the B-17 Flying Fortress could not defend itself. Hitler's underestimation seemed to be paying off. He was right. The Americans were bleeding themselves white against his defenses. But this is where his real underestimation began. He mistook American grit for arrogance. He mistook our willingness to take losses as a sign of desperation. He didn't understand that for the American command, these losses were not a reason to stop the campaign. They were a reason to solve the problem. General Henry Hap Arnold, the head of the entire Army Air Forces, was a man obsessed. He saw the reports, he read the casualty lists, and he sent a message back to his commanders in Europe. We have to have an escort. Find me a fighter that can go all the way.
The pressure was immense. Because the Schweinfurt raid, as bad as it was, had not been enough. The Germans, with incredible speed, dispersed their ball-bearing manufacturing, so the 8th Air Force had to go back. On October 14, 1943, they launched another maximum effort, this time aimed solely at Schweinfurt. 291 B-17s took to the air. The crews knew what was waiting for them. They were flying back into the same inferno that had consumed their friends just weeks before. The P-47s and P-38s, now with primitive drop tanks, pushed deeper into Germany than ever before, fighting with a desperate fury. But one by one, their fuel gauges dipped into the red. Over the radio, the bomber crews heard the signal. The fighters were turning back. What followed is known in 8th Air Force history simply as Black Thursday. The moment the escorts left, the full, unbridled fury of the German fighter arm fell upon the bomber stream. They attacked in company front formations, 30 and 40 fighters at a time, flying wingtip to wingtip, launching rockets and then plowing straight through the formations with cannons blazing. For the American gunners, it was a target-rich environment, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a garden hose. Bombers began to fall. Not one or two, but dozens. All along the route to Schweinfurt and all the way back, the sky was filled with burning planes, with parachutes, with smoke and death.
When the last shattered B-17s limped back to England that evening, the scale of the defeat was staggering. 60 bombers were lost over Germany. Another 17 were so badly damaged they were written off. 5 more crashed on landing. In total, 77 bombers, 770 men, were gone. Nearly a third of the attacking force had been wiped out. The 8th Air Force was, effectively, broken. The daylight bombing campaign was suspended. We were forbidden from flying deep into Germany again. Hitler had been right. Goering had been right. Our planes, our strategy, our men, they were not enough. The underestimation had been on our side. We had underestimated the enemy. This was the absolute darkest moment of the air war. The American strategy was in ruins. The British were grimly vindicated in their night-bombing-only approach. The press was starting to ask questions, and Hitler had every reason to believe he had won the air war over the Reich. But the machine of war does not stop for grief. Back in Washington, Hap Arnold was furious. He didn't see a defeat. He saw a problem that had not yet been solved. The bombers were not the problem. The crews were not the problem. The lack of an escort was the problem, and it had to be fixed. Now, all this time, the search for that long-range fighter had been frantic. The P-47 Jug was being improved. New models had more internal fuel. They were given drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty. This was a huge step. The Jug's range was pushed out and out and out. But it was still a compromise. It was a heavy plane, and lugging all that external fuel made it less nimble in a dogfight. The P-38 Lightning was also being improved. Its engine problems were slowly being ironed out, and its range was legendary. It would prove to be a war winner in the Pacific, where its 2 engines were a huge comfort to pilots flying over hundreds of miles of empty ocean. But in Europe, it remained a specialized tool.
And then there was the third option, a plane that almost nobody wanted. This brings us to the Sans Rolls-Royce part of our story. In 1940, before America was even in the war, the British had come to North American Aviation, a relatively new company, and asked them to build P-40 Warhawks for them. The head of NAA, a man named Dutch Kindleberger, famously said, "We can build you a better plane, and we can do it faster." In an astonishing 120 days, they designed and built the airframe for a new fighter, the NA-73X. The British loved the airframe. It was sleek, aerodynamic, and featured a revolutionary laminar flow wing. They called it the Mustang. But there was a catch. It was powered by an American-made Allison V1710 engine. The Allison was a solid, reliable engine. It was the same one used in the P-38 and P-40, but it had a critical flaw. Its supercharger was designed for low to medium altitudes. Below 15,000 feet, the Allison-powered P-51A was a rocket, one of the fastest planes in the sky. But up high, at the 25,000 to 30,000 foot altitudes where the B-17s flew, the engine ran out of breath. It lost power, it became sluggish. It was, in a word, a dog. The British used it for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, and they loved it for that. The USAF, which had reluctantly bought a few, did the same. It was seen as a mud mover, not a high-altitude interceptor. It was the plane without the right engine. This is where the story takes a turn that sounds like something out of a movie. In 1942, a British test pilot named Ronnie Harker was flying one of these new Allison-powered Mustangs. He was amazed by the airframe, its speed, its handling, but he was disgusted by its high-altitude performance. He wrote a memo that would change the course of the war. His suggestion was simple. Why don't we try putting one of our Merlin engines in it? The Rolls-Royce Merlin, specifically the Merlin 60 series, was the world's most advanced piston engine. It was the heart of the Spitfire, and its key, a revolutionary 2-stage, 2-speed automatic supercharger. This device, a marvel of engineering, could compress the thin air at high altitude, forcing it into the engine and allowing it to produce full power not just at 15,000 feet, but all the way up to 30,000 feet and beyond. The idea was so brilliant in its simplicity that it was almost immediately approved. Rolls-Royce flew a Merlin over to North America. Engineers from both companies in a hush-hush project worked around the clock. They had to modify the airframe, move the radiators, and figure out new engine mounts. It was a classic example of Allied cooperation. The result was the P-51B. It was a hybrid, the world's best airframe mated with the world's best engine. And the moment it took to the skies, everyone knew. This was it. This was the one. But an engine is a complex thing. We couldn't just get them from Britain, who needed every Merlin they could build for their own Spitfires and Lancasters. So, in another classic story of the arsenal of democracy, the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit was given the license to build the Merlin. They retooled with luxury car factories. They took the British plans, which were hand-drawn and full of quirks, and redrew them for American mass production. They figured out how to cast the complex engine blocks, how to machine the gears. The engine they produced, the Packard V1650, was a masterpiece. It was a Rolls-Royce Merlin, but built with American industrial power. By late 1943, just as Black Thursday was grounding the 8th Air Force, the first of these new Packard Merlin-powered P-51Bs were arriving in England. The change was immediate. The pilots were stunned. This plane was fast, faster than a Spitfire, faster than a Me-109, faster than an FW-190. It was nimble, and with drop tanks, its range was biblical. It could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes over the city, and fly all the way back. The little friend had finally grown up. Now Hitler's underestimation entered its final, fatal phase. He had been right about our early planes, but he was wrong about our ability to learn, to adapt, and to build. When his intelligence services reported this new Mustang, Goering and his staff were dismissive. They assumed it was just another American experiment, that it couldn't be produced in the numbers needed to make a difference. They believed their fortress Germany was still impregnable. They didn't realize that the floodgates of American industry had just opened.
The command of the 8th Air Force changed, too. General Eaker, the man who had championed the unescorted bomber, was moved. In his place came a man whose name was already legend. General Jimmy Doolittle, the man who had led the daring raid on Tokyo. Doolittle was a fighter pilot at heart, and he brought a new, ruthless philosophy. He looked at the growing fleets of P-47s, P-38s, and now the new P-51s, and he issued a new, revolutionary order. Before, the fighters' primary job was to protect the bombers. They were to stay close, to ward off attacks. Doolittle changed that. His new order was simple. Your primary mission is to seek out and destroy the German Air Force. Go where they are. Hunt them. Kill them. The strategy was no longer just about the bombers getting to the target. The strategy was now to use the bombers as bait. The bombers were the target the Luftwaffe had to attack, and when they rose to the challenge, our new fighters would be waiting for them. This shift in strategy culminated in February 1944 in a series of missions known as Big Week. For 7 days, the 8th Air Force, along with the 15th Air Force in Italy, threw everything they had at the German aircraft industry. But this time, when the bombers flew, they were surrounded by a swarm of hundreds and hundreds of fighters, P-47s, P-38s, and now the new P-51s. And they looked at the growing fleets of P-47s, P-38s, and now the new P-51s, and he issued a new, revolutionary order. Before, the fighters' primary job was to protect the bombers. They were to stay close, to ward off attacks. Doolittle changed that. His new order was simple. Your primary mission is to seek out and destroy the German Air Force. Go where they are. Hunt them. Kill them. The strategy was no longer just about the bombers getting to the target. The strategy was now to use the bombers as bait. The bombers were the target the Luftwaffe had to attack, and when they rose to the challenge, our new fighters would be waiting for them. This shift in strategy culminated in February 1944 in a series of missions known as Big Week. For 7 days, the 8th Air Force, along with the 15th Air Force in Italy, threw everything they had at the German aircraft industry. But this time, when the bombers flew, they were surrounded by a swarm of hundreds and hundreds of fighters, P-47s, P-38s, and now the new P-51s. The Luftwaffe was shattered. They were caught in a terrible dilemma. If they let the bombers through, their factories would be destroyed. But if they rose to attack the bombers, the American fighters would slaughter them. And that is precisely what happened. The German pilots, still brave, still skillful, found themselves overwhelmed. For every American plane lost, the Germans lost 2, then 3, then 4. We could replace our planes. We could replace our pilots thanks to a massive training program back home. But the Germans, they could not. They were losing their irreplaceable aces, the veterans of 100 fights. They were being bled dry, not by the bombers' 50 cals, but by the little friends that were no longer so little. For the bomber crews, the change was like the sun rising after a long, dark night. They would be flying deep over Germany, the flak bursting around them, and just as the tension became unbearable, they would hear a new sound on the radio. Bogies at 3 o'clock high. And then, a second later, a new, beautiful voice. Don't worry, fellas, we'll take 'em. And out of the sun would dive the P-51s, their silver wings flashing. They called them their little friends. They were the angels on their shoulders. The sight of a Mustang arriving over Berlin was, for many crewmen, the most beautiful sight of the war. The 25-mission tour, once a death sentence, was now possible. Morale soared. The men finally believed they had a fighting chance to make it home. It's this part of the story, the incredible turnaround, that often fascinates us. It's a testament to engineering and strategy. If you've ever worked on a complex problem, maybe in engineering or the military, or even just in your own workshop, we'd be honored if you'd share a bit of that story in the comments. What was the missing piece you finally found? Your experiences are a valuable part of this shared history, and we and the other viewers learn a great deal from them. So, what happened when Hitler underestimated U.S. long-range planes sans Rolls-Royces? The simple answer is that for about 18 brutal months, his underestimation was entirely correct. Our planes without that engine were not up to the job. He was right to believe our B-17s could not defend themselves. He was right to believe our early P-47s and P-38s could not provide the protection they needed. And he inflicted a cost on the 8th Air Force that would have broken the will of almost any other nation on Earth. But his victory was temporary, because his underestimation was deeper than just technology. He underestimated the American character. He didn't understand that we would see the failure of Black Thursday not as an end, but as a problem that had to be solved. He didn't believe we would have the humility to take a British engine and the industrial genius to build it ourselves. He didn't believe we would send thousands of our sons in planes that were finally a match for his to hunt his Luftwaffe to extinction. By the time the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the air war had been won. The skies over the invasion fleet were almost completely empty of German planes. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, was a broken, hunted, ineffective force. It had been systematically destroyed in the skies over its own homeland by the very planes Hitler had dismissed. The B-17s and B-24s were the sledgehammer relentlessly pounding the German war machine. But it was the P-51 Mustang, that perfect hybrid of American design and British genius, that allowed that sledgehammer to finally land its blows.
When we talk about this, it's vital we remember the men who flew before the Mustangs arrived, the crews of 1943, the men who flew to Schweinfurt, to Regensburg, to Bremen, knowing their escorts would have to turn back. They flew on anyway. They flew into a wall of flak and fighters with nothing but their own courage and the .50 calibers in their frozen hands. They are the ones who paid the butcher's bill for Black Thursday. They are the ones who bought, with their lives, the time for our industry to find the solution. Hitler was right about the planes, but he was dead wrong about the men. And that is what happened. The history of the 8th Air Force is filled with thousands of these stories of individual courage and incredible technological leaps. If you believe this history matters and you want to help us continue to tell these stories, the best way you can do that is to share this video with a friend or a family member who you think would appreciate it. It's a small act that makes a huge difference. We've talked a lot about the different fighters in this story. If you'd like to learn more about the plane that held the line before the Mustang arrived, the P-47 Thunderbolt, say yes in the comments section.
Thank you for spending this time with us today and for helping to keep these powerful memories alive.